The day the HOA cops, self-appointed of course, drove onto my property for an inspection, they fully intended to bury me in fines. They left on foot, after Grandpa Joe, bless his focused heart, processed their mode of transportation into a surprisingly small pile of high-grade scrap metal. How did it come to this, you ask? Pull up a chair, maybe grab a drink, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this one's a doozy, and you're going to want to hear every last detail. It all started, as these things often do, with a new neighbor and a sudden, inexplicable shift in the previously tranquil atmosphere of our little semi-rural enclave. Her name was Brenda McLaughlin, and she moved into the McMansion at the end of the cul-de-sac about 2 years before the incident. Brenda, from day one, carried herself like royalty inspecting the peasant hovels. She had that perfectly coiffed helmet of blonde hair that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, wore aggressively bright pantsuits that screamed, "important business," and drove a gleaming black Lexus SUV that always seemed to be just slightly too large for any parking space she chose. Our HOA had always been a fairly lax organization, mostly concerned with making sure the communal mailbox area didn't get overgrown and organizing the occasional potluck. Then Brenda got herself elected president. Suddenly, it was like living under a tiny, beautifully landscaped dictatorship. My property, you see, is a bit unique. I'm a sculptor, and my medium is reclaimed metal. I also run a small licensed side business doing custom metal fabrication and, yes, responsible scrap metal recycling. So, my 5 acres, which are thankfully at the very edge of the HOA's jurisdiction and mostly bordered by undeveloped county land, don't look like your typical suburban spread. There are organized piles of sheet steel, stacks of interesting girders, collections of antique machinery parts I plan to incorporate into artworks, and yes, a section where items are processed for recycling. It's my treasure trove, my outdoor studio, my livelihood. To Brenda, it was clearly an affront to her sensibilities, a personal insult scrawled in rust and steel across the landscape of her perfect world. The first notice I received was for unapproved landscaping elements, referring to a piece of abstract art I'd made from old plowshares, which was situated well within my property line and had been there for 3 years prior to her arrival. I politely responded with a copy of my original HOA agreement, which had no such restrictions, and a photo proving its long-standing placement. This seemed to only fuel her fire. Then came the letters about the aesthetic impact of my work vehicles, a well-maintained but undeniably rugged flatbed truck, and a forklift. Apparently, they detracted from the neighborhood's desired visual harmony. I started keeping a meticulous file. Every letter, every email, every passive-aggressive comment she'd make if she saw me at the local grocery store. My Grandpa Joe, who lives with me and helps out around the property, he's a retired heavy machinery operator and a wizard with anything mechanical, just used to chuckle and say, "That woman's got too much time and not enough real problems, Mark." He's a man of few words but immense common sense. He'd spend his days out back, sorting metals, maintaining the equipment, or, if he was feeling particularly energetic, operating the massive, diesel-powered metal shredder we use to process scrap down to a manageable size for transport to the larger recycling facilities. It was a noisy beast, but well within legal noise limits for the industrial zoning of that portion of my land, a fact I'd had to point out to Brenda on more than one occasion. She'd just sniff and say something about common decency being more important than technicalities. The tension kept ratcheting up. She tried to get new rules passed, specifically targeting my kind of operation. Rules about visible storage of non-decorative materials, noise levels during daytime hours that were frankly impossible for any kind of outdoor work, and even restrictions on the types of vehicles that could be parked on properties larger than 2 acres, clearly aimed at my truck. Most of these got voted down by the older residents who remembered what the neighborhood was like before the McMansions sprouted, or by people who simply valued their own freedom from overreach. But Brenda was persistent. She saw my place not just as an eyesore, but as a challenge to her authority, and I, apparently, was the uncooperative peasant who refused to bow. Little did she know, this peasant was also meticulously documenting her every move, her every overstep, just waiting. Because I had a feeling, a deep, gut feeling, that Brenda's obsession was going to lead her to do something spectacularly foolish. And Grandpa Joe? He just kept telling me, "Don't you worry, son. Folks like that, they always trip over their own feet eventually." I just didn't realize how literally. The official notices started arriving with alarming regularity. Warning: unkempt premises. One would blare, citing a stack of old corrugated roofing I had specifically sourced for a large commissioned sculpture of a phoenix. Violation: improper storage of industrial materials, another declared. Referring to a neatly palletized collection of vintage engine blocks I was planning to turn into avant-garde garden furniture. Each one was a masterpiece of bureaucratic indignation, filled with vaguely worded accusations and threats of escalating fines. I'd respond to each with calm, factual rebuttals, often accompanied by photographs, excerpts from the county zoning regulations for my specific parcel, which, unlike the newer developments, had a grandfathered clause, allowing for light industrial and artistic enterprise. And sometimes, just for kicks, a printout of the dictionary definition of art. Brenda, of course, was having none of it. She seemed to operate under the principle that if she repeated a falsehood loudly enough and often enough, it would magically become true. Her ally in these endeavors was a weaselly little man named Chad Peterson, the HOA treasurer, who seemed to live in permanent awe, or perhaps terror, of Brenda. Chad was the kind of guy who always looked like he'd just been caught with his hand in the cookie jar, even when he was just standing there. He'd parrot Brenda's pronouncements, nodding vigorously, his eyes darting around as if seeking approval from an invisible audience. Together, they were a formidable duo of self-righteousness. I knew a confrontation was inevitable, so I doubled down on my own preparations. I reviewed every single HOA bylaw, every covenant, every recorded meeting minute I could get my hands on. I consulted an old friend who was a lawyer, just to understand the exact limits of their power and the strengths of my position. He confirmed what I suspected. As long as I was operating within my zoning and permits, and not creating an actual public nuisance, which I wasn't. The shredder noise was intermittent, and always during approved hours, and everything was contained on my property. Their aesthetic complaints were largely hot air. But hot air can still fuel a pretty nasty fire if it's blown by someone with enough perceived authority. Then came the official letter that set the stage for the final act. Notice of official on-site inspection. It stated that President McLaughlin and Treasurer Peterson would be conducting a thorough inspection of my property on a specific date and time to document numerous ongoing violations and assess appropriate penalties. The tone was less of an impartial assessment and more of a foregone conclusion. They weren't coming to inspect, they were coming to find fault and levy fines, pure and simple. I almost laughed. The audacity was breathtaking. My lawyer friend advised me to allow the inspection, as refusing could technically be seen as non-compliant, but to document everything meticulously. "Let them walk into their own trap, Mark," he'd said with a grin. "People like that can't help themselves." The morning of the inspection dawned bright and clear. I made sure Grandpa Joe knew that some important HOA folks were coming to look around the yard for problems. Grandpa Joe just grunted. "Problems? Only problem round here is folks looking for 'em where there ain't none." He then went back to his project for the day, which was clearing out what he called Bay 3. Bay 3 was a designated area near the large shredder where we put items specifically slated for immediate processing, things that were genuinely just scrap, too far gone for art or repurposing. I'd told him the day before, "Grandpa, that whole Bay 3 needs to be cleared out tomorrow. Everything in it, no exceptions. Got a shipment of new material coming? Need the space." There was an old, completely rusted-out shell of a Fiat I'd dragged out of a ditch years ago, sitting in Bay 3, among other unsalvageable bits. That was the junker car I'd specifically pointed out as needing to go. He nodded, his mind already on the task. He's a man who likes clear instructions and a clean workspace. Promptly at 10:00 a.m., a vehicle crunched up my gravel driveway. It wasn't Brenda's Lexus, which surprised me. Instead, it was a slightly sad-looking, dark blue Ford Crown Victoria, the kind ex-police cars often become. This one had a rather amateurishly applied magnetic sticker on the door that read, in stark white letters, Community Standards Enforcement, Oakhaven HOA. It was so comically officious, I had to bite back a smile. Out stepped Brenda, resplendent in a canary yellow pantsuit today, clipboard already in hand, her expression one of grim determination. Chad scurried out from the passenger side, clutching a digital camera like it was a holy relic. They surveyed my domain with undisguised distaste. My workshop, a converted barn, was open, showing glimpses of welding equipment and works in progress. Neatly stacked pallets of interesting metal shapes, gears, pipes, strange industrial remnants were arranged in what I considered an outdoor library of potential. To them, it was clearly just a mess. "Mr. Henderson," Brenda began, her voice dripping with condescension, "we are here, as per the official notification, to conduct an inspection of these premises." Chad was already snapping pictures of a pile of antique wrought iron fencing I'd just acquired. "Let's just get this over with," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Where would you like to start?" Brenda smirked. "We'll start with the most egregious violations first, I think. Lead the way to your Junkyard." And with that, they strode purposefully past my workshop, past the organized stacks, heading towards the back of the property where Bay 3 and the shredder were located, their noses practically in the air. The HOA cops were on the case. Brenda and Chad marched through my property like conquering heroes inspecting a newly subjugated and deeply unsatisfactory territory. Chad, with his camera flashing, seemed to be documenting every perceived speck of rust, every creatively repurposed item, as if it were evidence in a capital crime. Brenda would point at something, a stack of carefully sorted copper pipes, for instance, and declare, that is clearly unsightly. A definite violation of aesthetic harmony." I'd calmly reply, "That, Ms. McLaughlin, is high-grade copper tubing awaiting fabrication into a commissioned fountain. It's worth about $3,000 as it sits." Her eyes would narrow, but she'd tick something off on her clipboard with a vicious little scratch of her pen. They made their way towards the back, closer and closer to where Grandpa Joe was diligently working. The distinct rhythmic clang and occasional roar of the grapple arm on his old case backhoe could be heard, punctuated by the low rumble of its diesel engine. They were heading straight for the area around Bay 3, which was, admittedly, the most industrial-looking part of my setup. This was where the real scrap, the unsalvageable stuff destined for the shredder, was accumulated before processing. And where was their noble community standards enforcement vehicle? They'd parked it, with an air of supreme entitlement, directly in Bay 3, right next to the rusted-out Fiat shell that was first on Grandpa's list for the shredder. I'd almost done a double take when I saw them pull in and Chad maneuver the Crown Vic into that precise spot, as if it were a VIP parking space, personally reserved for their critical mission. I hadn't said a word, just made a mental note. It was almost too perfect. While Brenda was dramatically gesturing at a pile of discarded tractor parts, declaring them a veritable mountain of refuse, I heard the unmistakable sound of Grandpa Joe firing up the big shredder. It started with a low growl, then escalated to a thunderous, metal-chewing roar that vibrated through the ground. Brenda flinched. "Good heavens, what is that dreadful noise?" she exclaimed, clutching her pearls, or rather, the chunky faux gold chain around her neck. "That's my shredder," I said calmly. "Processing some scrap metal. It's a noisy job, but someone's got to do it. Perfectly legal during daytime hours, of course." She gave me a withering look, but pressed on, determined to find more violations. Chad, meanwhile, was practically cowering behind her every time the shredder hit a particularly dense piece of metal with a deafening crunch. From my vantage point, while pretending to listen to Brenda's litany of complaints about a perfectly benign stack of aluminum siding, I could see Grandpa Joe in action. He was a poet of heavy machinery, that man. He maneuvered the backhoe with its grapple attachment, with surprising delicacy for such a brute of a machine. I saw him effortlessly pluck the old Fiat shell, swing it over the hopper of the shredder, and drop it in. The shredder screamed in delight, a cacophony of tearing, rending metal, then a rain of fist-sized chunks clattered into the collection bin. Grandpa Joe, oblivious to the HOA drama unfolding just 100 yards away, dusted off his hands, climbed down from the backhoe, and surveyed Bay 3. His gaze fell upon the only remaining vehicle in the to-be-processed zone, the HOA's dark blue Crown Victoria. It was parked right where the Fiat had been moments before. He scratched his head for a second, a thoughtful look on his face. I could almost hear his internal monologue. Mark must have brought another one in while I was on the backhoe. Said clear everything in Bay 3. Well, orders are orders. He ambled over to the forklift this time, a much larger one we used for heavier items. He carefully maneuvered the forks under the Crown Vic. Brenda was now expounding on the unacceptable levels of visible rust on an antique weather vane I was restoring. This entire operation, she declared, waving her hand dismissively at my life's work, is a blight, I tell you. I saw the Crown Victoria lift gracefully into the air, dangling precariously but securely from the forklift tines. Grandpa Joe, with the focused precision of a brain surgeon, began to drive it slowly towards the still rumbling shredder. My heart was doing a little tap dance. This was either going to be a catastrophe or the most beautiful piece of accidental justice I'd ever witness. I kept my face a perfect mask of polite, if slightly bored attention as Brenda continued her tirade. Chad was now busy photographing a small patch of oil on the gravel driveway near my workshop, a spot where my truck had admittedly leaked a tiny bit before I'd fixed it. "Ground contamination," he chirped, looking to Brenda for approval. "Oh, absolutely," she cooed. "Severe environmental hazard. That's a big fine, Chad. A very big fine." The Crown Victoria was now poised directly over the shredder's gaping maw. Grandpa Joe gave a lever, a gentle nudge. With a surprisingly gentle slide, the Community Standards Enforcement vehicle began its final journey. The shredder didn't even hesitate. The initial impact was a horrifying shriek of tortured metal, followed by a series of apocalyptic crunches and bangs that were noticeably louder and more complex than when it had consumed the Fiat. Even Brenda paused mid-sentence, a flicker of something, annoyance, alarm, crossing her face. "What on earth was that?" she demanded. "Sounds like it hit something dense," I offered, trying to sound casual. "Probably an engine block in that old car he's processing." She sniffed again, clearly annoyed that my industrial noise was interrupting her very important pronouncements. The shredding continued, a symphony of destruction. I could see bits of dark blue paint, chrome trim, and shattered safety glass joining the rain of scrap into the bin. It was surprisingly quick. Industrial shredders, it turns out, are remarkably efficient. Brenda finally seemed satisfied with her list of grievances. She tapped her pen decisively on her clipboard, a smug little smile playing on her lips. "Well, Mr. Henderson," she announced, her voice full of malicious triumph, "I think we have more than enough evidence here. You can expect to receive official notification of fines totaling, well, let's just say it will be a very substantial amount. Perhaps this will finally encourage you to bring your establishment into compliance with community standards." Chad, beaming, chimed in. "Yes, substantial. We documented at least 15 separate serious violations, some of them recurring daily." I nodded slowly. "I see. Well, thank you for your thoroughness, Miss McLaughlin. Mr. Peterson, I'll await your correspondence." I kept my tone perfectly level, giving nothing away. Internally, I was wondering if they preferred their crow served hot or cold. "Indeed you will," Brenda said, puffing herself up. "We will be taking our leave now. I trust you'll reflect on the seriousness of this situation." She turned on her heel, expecting Chad to scurry after her, which he did. They marched back towards the front of the property, or rather, towards Bay 3, where their noble steed had been parked. I followed at a leisurely pace, savoring the anticipation. They reached the edge of Bay 3, which was now conspicuously empty, save for a few stray scraps of metal and the fading impression of tire tracks in the dirt where the Fiat and then the Crown Vic had rested. Brenda stopped dead. Her head swiveled left, then right. A confused frown creased her brow. "Chad," she said, her voice suddenly a little less certain. Where did you park the car?" Chad looked around, equally bewildered. "Right here, Brenda. I parked it right here, next to that other old junker." His eyes scanned the empty space, growing wider. It's gone." Brenda's perfectly made-up face began to contort. "What do you mean, it's gone? Cars don't just get gone, Chad. Did you leave the keys in it? Did someone steal an HOA vehicle from right under our noses on this degenerate's property?" She shrieked, whirling to glare at me. "Henderson, what have you done with our car?" I spread my hands in a gesture of innocent bafflement. "Your car?" "I haven't touched your car, Ms. McLaughlin. Last I saw it, you parked it right over there." I gestured vaguely to the empty Bay 3. "Are you sure this is where you left it?" Just then, Grandpa Joe came trudging around the corner of the workshop, wiping grease from his hands with an old rag. He looked tired but satisfied, the way a man does after a good day's hard work. "All done with Bay 3, Mark," he called out. "Cleared out every last bit, just like you said. That old Fiat, and then that other sedan that was parked in there. Processed clean. Shredder worked like a dream on that last one, though. Bit more plastic and upholstery than the Fiat, but it chewed right through it. Good quality steel in that frame, too." He paused, noticing Brenda and Chad's expressions of stunned horror. He then held up a twisted, vaguely recognizable piece of metal that still had a flake of dark blue paint adhering to it, and a piece of chrome that looked suspiciously like it came from a Ford Crown Victoria's grille. "This bit was a little stubborn," he said, peering at it. "But we got her. Good scrap now." Brenda's jaw had dropped so far I thought it might actually dislocate. Chad looked like he was about to faint. His face had gone a sickly pale green. That was our car." Brenda finally managed to sputter, pointing a trembling, canary yellow-clad finger at the mangled piece of metal in Grandpa Joe's hand. "Your car?" Grandpa Joe looked from her to the scrap, then to me, a slow dawning of comprehension on his face. Oh dear." He looked genuinely contrite. "Mark, you didn't tell me they were going to park their good car in the shredder queue?" I stepped forward, adopting a tone of mild, apologetic surprise. "Grandpa, you shredded their car?" "Oh, goodness. Miss McLaughlin, Mr. Peterson, I am truly sorry. You see, you parked your vehicle directly in Bay 3. That's our designated immediate processing zone for scrap metal. There's a sign and everything." I casually gestured to a faded, very small, and conveniently grease-smudged sign on a nearby fence post that read, in barely legible letters, "Bay 3, active processing. Authorized material only." I may or may not have hastily wiped some of the grease off it with my thumb when they weren't looking earlier. Grandpa had standing instructions to clear everything in Bay 3 today. He must have assumed, he assumed it was another piece of scrap I'd brought in for him to process. He's very diligent, you see. Never leaves a job half done. My deepest apologies, he can be a bit zealous when it comes to clearing the processing bays. I probably should have put up some more prominent cones if visitors were going to park in an active industrial operations area. Brenda's face was cycling through an astonishing array of colors, from chalk white to puce to a furious, blotchy red. You monster!" she finally shrieked, though it was more of a strangled squawk. "You did this on purpose. This is destruction of property. We're calling the police. You'll pay for this. You'll lose everything." The ensuing meltdown was truly a sight to behold. Brenda was practically vibrating with rage, her expensive pantsuit seeming to quiver in sympathy. Chad just stood there, looking like a goldfish that had been unexpectedly launched onto a hot sidewalk, his mouth opening and closing silently. "Now, Ms. McLaughlin," I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable, which only seemed to infuriate her further. "Let's not jump to conclusions. As I explained, you parked your vehicle on private property, in an active industrial processing zone that was clearly, if perhaps subtly, marked. Grandpa Joe was simply following his instructions for the day, which were to process all materials located within Bay 3. It was an unfortunate accident, certainly, but one that might have been avoided had your driver exercised a bit more caution about where he left an unattended vehicle in an area with active heavy machinery and, well, an industrial metal shredder. I paused, letting that sink in. As for the rather extensive list of fines you were threatening me with just moments ago, I imagine those might be somewhat difficult to enforce now given the circumstances. Brenda actually stomped her foot. This is outrageous. We demand compensation. That was an official HOA vehicle. We're calling the sheriff. By all means, I said, gesturing towards the main road. Their station is just down the highway. I'm sure they'd be interested to hear how an HOA vehicle came to be parked and abandoned in a designated scrap processing bay on private industrial land. She did indeed call the sheriff. 2 deputies arrived about 20 minutes later, looking rather unenthusiastic about being dragged into an HOA squabble on a sunny afternoon. Brenda, now somewhat teary and disheveled, launched into a high-pitched, rambling account of my supposed villainy, Chad nodding miserably beside her. I calmly explained my side, pointing out my business licenses, the zoning for that part of my property, the, now slightly more visible, sign for Bay 3, and Grandpa Joe's very clear, if unfortunately executed, instructions. Grandpa Joe, looking penitent but firm, repeated that he was just doing what Mark told me. Clear Bay 3. Car was in Bay 3. One of the deputies, a grizzled older fellow with a hint of a smile playing around his eyes, walked over to the shredder's output bin, peered in at the multicolored confetti of metal, then looked at the community standards enforcement magnet that had somehow survived the initial crunch and was lying on the ground near the machine. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and then looked at me. I could swear I saw him suppress a chuckle. After taking statements and looking around, the deputies conferred. The older one finally came back over. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, "as far as we can tell, this is a civil matter. Mr. Henderson operates a licensed business on his property. Your vehicle was parked in an area he designates as an active processing zone. While unfortunate, it appears to have been an accident stemming from a misunderstanding and, frankly, questionable parking." Brenda started to protest, but he held up a hand. "You're free to pursue this in civil court if you wish, but I don't see any criminal intent here. As for Mr. Henderson's alleged HOA violations," he glanced at my property, then back at Brenda, "those are also civil matters, between you and him and your HOA." With that, they tipped their hats and left, leaving Brenda and Chad standing amidst the metaphorical and literal wreckage of their authority. The silence that followed was thick. Chad finally found his voice, a weak squeak. "Brenda, how are we going to get back? And what are we going to tell the board about the car?" Brenda looked like she might spontaneously combust. She didn't answer, just spun on her heel and started storming down my driveway on foot, her canary yellow pantsuit now looking rather deflated. Chad gave me one last, mournful look and scurried after her. I watched them go, 2 rapidly diminishing figures of fury and despair, trudging down the long gravel drive. Grandpa Joe came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, son," he said, a twinkle in his eye, "reckon they won't be in such a hurry to inspect your Junkyard again any time soon." He then looked at the shredder's output bin. "Did make some right pretty confetti out of that old Ford, though. Good mix of colors." The aftermath was, in a word, glorious. The story ripped through the neighborhood like wildfire, fueled by my slightly more detailed, and perhaps embellished for comedic effect when told to close friends, version of events. Brenda McLaughlin became known, not so affectionately, as Shredder Brenda. The HOA board meeting where she and Chad had to explain the loss of the Community Standards Enforcement vehicle was apparently legendary. They tried to spin it as my malicious destruction of HOA property, but too many people knew about Bay 3, and my reputation for being meticulous, not malicious. Plus, the sheer comic incompetence of parking in an industrial shredder's loading zone undermined their credibility. The board, faced with replacing a vehicle and the potential for a lawsuit from me for harassment and trespass. My lawyer friend had suggested this as a delicious irony, quietly decided to drop all pending violations against me. Brenda was forced to resign as president, in disgrace, the financial hit, and the sheer humiliation being too much. Chad slunk back into the shadows, rarely seen again at meetings. The HOA itself became remarkably more reasonable overnight. It was as if a cloud of petty tyranny had lifted. Other neighbors, who had also suffered under Brenda's reign, privately thanked me. My junkyard continued to thrive. My sculptures got bigger and more ambitious, and Grandpa Joe got a hefty bonus and a new, top-of-the-line reclining armchair for his troubles. Sometimes, justice doesn't just knock. It arrives via forklift and gets processed at high speed. And you know, I still wonder what exact shade of substantial those fines were supposed to be. I guess we'll never know. So, what's the craziest encounter you've ever had with an overzealous authority figure, HOA or otherwise? Drop your story in the comments below. I genuinely love to read them. And if you want to hear more tales from the Junkyard, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You never know when inspiration or an HOA vehicle might drop in.